Hi, this is Paul. And today for our live stream, as some of you might be noticing, I've been doing some different things with the Friday live streams. We've had Kel Zeldin on. Last week we had a group that wanted to talk to me about Tucker Carlson and my ignorance of him. And this week, in anticipation of the conference that's coming up in Chino, you can still buy tickets today and tomorrow for the conference. But ticket sales are going to close because Vervaeke needs a number to give to his caterers so they know how much food to bring in. Dr. Jim, who's been on the channel a lot, we've talked, well, not a lot, a few times. We've talked about Westerns. We've talked about a whole variety of things. And last time when we spoke, he said, there's some other things I'd really like to talk about, especially it's sort of connected with the conference. And so I said, well, let's do that on the live stream before the conference. And so welcome again to the channel, Dr. Jim.
Thanks. As usual, thanks a lot. I feel like you indulge me and my desire to hear myself talk, and I'm very grateful of that.
You give me a lot of good things to think about. And so, I mean, you've noticed that I clip a lot of our talks because a lot of the things that you say sort of continue to churn there in the Consciousness Congress.
Well, that's good. I'm happy that that's the case. Lots of I've lived my life kind of steeped in ideas one after the other. It's been part of the way I've kind of journeyed, if you will. And so that's why this little corner, I think, is maybe one version of my spiritual home, and kind of thought we could talk about that. I'm ready to commit a weekend and fly down to California to get together with you guys. So it must mean something to me, I guess. So I thought we could talk about that. What is the idea of the spiritual home? What's a quest? How does that fit with the different participants? I have some ideas about, hey, maybe how would we think about Vervaeke, not that I'm going to psychoanalyze these guys, but Vervaeke, Pageau, maybe some other individuals, and maybe myself. I'm leaving you off the list. I'll let you speak for yourself, I guess. So that's the idea, and maybe to set up the conference. One of the other things I was hoping to do was to make it. I don't know. I tend to think I'm talking about myself, but tend to maybe sound abstract a lot. So maybe I'm hoping to give people entry to be able to, approach me and talk with me about the things that I've talked about, and kind of break an opening for people to have conversation when I get down there.
Yeah. One of the things that we have, so those who have registered for the conference, you should have gotten an email with a Discord link, however comfortable people are with Discord servers. And that varies, but the schedule is on it. And we have built into the conference, not only are we going to have speaker talks, and then we'll have panels about the speaker talks, and we'll have question and answer for them, but we've also built in the conference times for more estuary type gatherings where people can get together in groups of 6 or 8 and really start to sort of burrow down and digest this stuff, and hopefully do some applications, some pondering on the topics. Because, even for myself, when you have a topic like this, and again, we came up with the topic of the conference together, the 5 of us, Vervaeke, Catherine, Pageau, Vervaeke, and myself. It's an evocative topic because home is it's came up in sort of the warm-up conversation that we did. Home is a very complex place. There are expectations of rest, of comfort, of security, but also of challenge. In many ways, no place is more challenging to any of us than our home. So I don't know, wherever you want to start, you just go ahead and dive in, and we'll
I've got like a kind of a number of different ideas, and I've kind of been working and I can be scattered, so I hope it doesn't come out too scattered.
You might have to move away from that. Don't watch the chat. They're just having fun in that.
Oh yeah, I remember from the last time. It's not gonna help me to look at the chat. So
no, it won't.
I'm trying to not do that. I guess I would say some things about what, kind of in a broad abstract sense. What about a home? And I want to say some things as I've been thinking about this. I want to say some things about that. One is that a home is not an end. That is, it's not, to use Christian terms, it's not the eschaton. It's not salvation. It's not transcendent in that sense. It's therefore in the middle of the arc of the journey in some way. It's also it's also not tranquility. It's not, what you might get when you kind of reach some state of meditative bliss. It's certainly, so that's not where we're going if we're trying to go to a home. And those are just some generic thoughts about that. I would say and this is how I kind of wanted to structure my thoughts, and you can feedback and see what you think. I wanted to structure it on an end, a goal. It is a goal. It's an end. And T.S. Eliot, who is my spiritual guide, has a quote, "In my beginning is my end." Here, that can mean a whole bunch of different things, but one of the things end can be there is purpose or goal. And that end, if we're for the moment kind of take that to be a home, is going to be fully kind of elaborated based on where we come from. What our, in Christian terms, what our formation is going to determine the possibilities of what we might take to be our home. And that's how I kind of wanted to look at, some of the different figures in this corner, maybe ultimately myself. The thought I had was something like with John Vervaeke. And again, I don't want to speak for him. He will speak for himself, of course. I'm just speaking for the kind of archetype that I take him to represent. And he is a guy who came from, we all know this story, he came from that fundamentalist background that ultimately he had to leave. And he had to leave it in a way that I would want to say is closer to a kind of transformative experience than it is an evolution or a progress. And so he is, in a sense, and this might be a little bit too strong a term, but he is in a sense cast out or exiled from that origin. And so now he's of course found himself in another kind of place after that progress, but what I see him doing in a way is somehow framed by that fact. He's kind of reaching for all of the possibilities and the capacities that he has, the intellectual competency that he has, the resources that he's able to gather and bring forth, and trying to create something new, to create something out in the, I wouldn't go so far as to say out in the wilderness, but out beyond that origin. And implied in that, I think, is that he can't go back to that starting point. And that kind of defines, in a way, what it's going to be that is going to be possible for him as his spiritual home. And I want to make sure I'm framing that in completely neutral terms, in terms of some sort of judgment, because I resonate with a lot of that, although I do not have that kind of deconstructive origin, and it changes, I think, in a big way for myself. And if in this conversation we're able to get to having me kind of talk that through, I'll describe myself in contrast to that, I think, in a big way. What are your thoughts there on that?
Yeah, I think And a number of things you said I really resonated with. Leaving that fundamentalist background as a transformation to, knowing, even though that's not my story, I
Sorry about that.
That's
I got a visiting dog here today, so it's going to be unpredictable.
all right.
She's okay, I think.
Yeah. My story is very different in that I'm third generation Christian Reformed minister. I'm in the same denomination that my family has always been. I've never felt the need to leave it. I'm pastoring a church, which is in some ways in continuity with the church I grew up in. I mean, in that sense, John and I are sort of polar opposites. I've in some ways, in other ways have, in some ways never left home. I just live on the other coast. And John very much in his story. And it's been very interesting watching the evolution. The video I just released this morning, I talk a little bit about the fact that this formation is ongoing with us. And John began his journey in the YouTube space. He was already a university lecturer. He was already a cognitive scientist, used to the academy and to publishing. But now suddenly his face is on YouTube. He's subject to the algorithm. He's subject to the comments section. He's subject to the commentaries by myself and just about anybody else who has a view and an opinion. So, and someone who very openly has said that he has a fair amount of anxiety with respect to attention. This is for him, this is a much different journey than someone like me who, truth be told, probably likes the attention, at least to some degree or not, or I wouldn't have got myself into this. And so then, beginning my first conversation with him, expressed, some reticence to talk about the place he grew up and his experience there. The longer that he's been in front of the camera, I've watched a number of interviews where he's been able to talk about that more easily, been able to disclose a little bit more. I think typical of John, he's careful. He tries to be respectful of his home of origin. But even when he talks about the fact that with respect to his meaning crisis, many people can find solace and home and comfort in the legacy religions, as he calls them. For others, and especially for him, he doesn't see those as viable options. And this is where where myself, Jonathan Pageau, and John Vervaeke are sort of in a spectrum, because Pageau, of course, his family was within a trajectory of French Canadian to evangelical. His father, for a while.
Is that you can hear my dog back there?
Yeah, that's fine.
Hopefully she'll settle down here.
Dog longing for home. So Pageau, in a sense, is someone who has had transformations, but with respect to Christianity, how on earth do you ever measure these things? I mean, he still very much counts himself in the Christian fold. And for Jonathan Pageau, if we have a legacy version of Christianity on the menu, orthodoxy is it. Okay. So Pageau goes all the way back to one of the most legacy elements of Christianity. And I still say sort of in the Midlands, who has never really left my tradition.
Right. I like literary kind of examples. So I was going to put Jonathan Pageau as Odysseus. And he's kind of left home, gone. He's kind of wily. He's kind of maybe a little bit of a trickster. He's smart. He knows the world. Never really deconstructed. I wouldn't think of Pageau as really deconstructing, although, in again, T.S. Eliot terms, he went on a journey and he came home. And home was different because he went on the journey, but it was still home. It was still home for him. and so he didn't really have that thing that I was kind of talking about with Vervaeke as a kind of metaphysically deep transformation, if you will, that I think Vervaeke is in the midst of. So I think that's one way to frame it. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I didn't actually try to frame your journey, because I think it is, you were back at home waiting for Pageau to come back. I don't know. Never left, never went to Troy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I stayed at home in some ways. And perhaps in some ways my own, there's a sense in which perhaps John Vervaeke's YouTube Odyssey is a search for home in a way that mine isn't as much of.
Yeah, again, another literary example here. I can put on him, and I don't want to kind of, I expect everybody to know all these things, but The Tempest by Shakespeare. Prospero is a guy. Hopefully, I'm not breaking up too much for you there.
No, your voice is still good. So
Prospero is a guy who was banished. In a certain sense, I think you can think of Prospero, to tell the story really quick. These are city-states in Italy. He gets kind of usurped by a group of kind of Machiavellian types, and he gets banished. He's a kind of figure of both a kind of Merlin-esque like figure, and an alchemist-like figure, a kind of a guy in control of magic. But he's also really a humanist. He's really a modern, he's the new man. Prospero is. So in a way, and if you know the story, he's making things happen. He's making storms happen, and he's from this island that he's been banished to. And in a way, it kind of inverts our thought of the past, because the image there that Shakespeare's painting is that the medieval world was actually the world that was disenchanted. And it was disenchanted in the form of Machiavelli. So, and you can kind of see that, I think, in maybe the way Luther might have imagined the church. Even Erasmus might have imagined the church as, kind of involved in this kind of Machiavellian imminent battle of for power, struggles, that kind of thing. And Prospero is the new man. He's pointing to the future. He's gonna be the future. And it's kind of science-like. He knows nature, and he nonetheless, he's banished. And the story starts with him seeking revenge, and ultimately leads to reconciliation. He ultimately reconciles with the guy, Alonso, who was the guy who was responsible for his banishment, and of course the real kind of reconciliation and redemption comes from the children. His daughter marries the son of Alonso, and so we now have this kind of future in which there's reconciliation, there's forgiveness, there's redemption, and a future which is somehow the combination of the new and the old in some sort of a real reconciled possibility. So perhaps we could see, John's, unlike, let's say, Sam Harris, he's not just wanting to be congenial, he's wanting to reach back into that tradition and somehow, bring it into reality without necessarily not being that person who went through that transformative experience. And, and you can see him kind of doing this. He definitely wants to be on the levers of these scientific possibilities and tools. The kind of alchemist image of Prospero fits with that, I think. And that's kind of how I see Vervaeke, in all positive terms, with great heart.
Yeah. It's interesting, the tensions within, let's say, the alchemist, because and Lewis points this out regularly in some of his less popular writings. that, in astrology, which to us sounds very new agey, is actually a determinism. Alchemy, which sounds very enchanted to us, is in many ways the height of technological ambition. That
Exactly.
even to the very essence of lead, we can have mastery over it and turn it to gold. And in terms of the enchantment argument, it's been interesting that Justin Brierley, now that he's stepped away from Premier Radio, he's sort of now being more of a player rather than a ref. His first podcasts have focused on enchantment, which is, of course, sort of where Rod Dreher is. There's a tension within John Vervaeke's work of science, the science of enchantment. I mean, it's almost like the squareness of the circle.
I really think back, in 1600 when Shakespeare wrote this, it would be natural to attach to that alchemist. You wouldn't see the alchemist as the guy from the past, as we do. You would see that as the guy pushing into the future, the guy who's trying to get a hold of the ways in which you can manipulate and push the buttons of nature to make things happen, to make enchanted things happen. And now we see it obviously as, as kind of inert. This is a kind of a inert materialistic vision.
And this is sort of where I think Peterson in some ways fits in, because it was Peterson who, leaned into the fact that a bunch of these modern psychologists who basically looked at what Jung wrote with respect to alchemy and threw that out and said, this is inscrutable. Why on earth would Carl Jung be paying attention to alchemy? And Peterson focuses in there and says, no, this is actually key to this whole question of science and enchantment. And like McGilchrist does at the preface of not his latest book, but the one before that,
Master and His Emissary.
That's right. He drills into this fact that we are, we in the modern period, we are all about the explaining, and the explaining is in an inverse relationship with enchantment, and that isn't going away. Yet now we long for which can't be explained. And I think in many ways, John, with John's relevance realization, a lot of the pieces that John is sort of bringing to the table and language that he's bringing to the table, even his recent AI talk sort of raises all of those tensions. And so if you, and pastors, of course, well, I don't know, in churches, this is also a little bit weird, but in a sense, John is trying to participate in the erection of a non-theistic ecology of practices to provoke, the end to this meaning crisis. But if the end of your meaning crisis is achieved rather than received, will you really abolish your meaning crisis? I mean, because all of these things are sort of bound together.
Yeah, I agree with that. You have a feeling that he's still moving, he's still seeking, he's still trying to, like you said, construct and make foundations, and that's definitely true. Peterson doesn't. I don't know about Peterson in terms of this whole thing. Of course, again, this is all just wild speculation, but I would almost think of him as someone alongside Odysseus coming back from Troy who got lost. And this is not critical necessarily, but he's floundering might be too strong a term, because it's got a kind of a negative valence to it that I'm not necessarily intending, but a kind of feverishness in Peterson to try to grab something, to try to make something happen, to try to feel something that feels solid to him or something. And regularly kind of being, I wouldn't quite say thwarted, but not necessarily settling that's a possibility for him. And that it's me talking about a guy I don't have any idea about. So I don't want to be
it's
seeming personal, and
right.
judging
Well,
him or anything, but
there's
that's
a
what it
degree,
feels like to me.
And both, of course, both John and Jonathan know Jordan personally, which
Right.
it both adds information and forces them to respect concealment and lack of disclosure.
Certainly.
But Jordan, it seems to me, is more of an Agamemnon figure, and it's like, all right, we're going to go to Troy.
There you go.
All those wokesters are holed up behind the walls of Troy. Let's get our ships over there.
There you go. Absolutely. I think that
take
might be
care
the
of
one.
this Troy problem right now.
Actually, you're absolutely right about that. That's perfect. That's perfect. Doesn't end well for Agamemnon.
No, it doesn't.
But
and the irony, of course, is that this is I think, one of Rene Girard's great insights, is that mimetic rivalry forces the two sides then are formed to become like opposites of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And which is part of the caution from Rene Girard, is that, in some ways, mimetic rivalry is inevitable, but woe to you to whom it comes, because you may very quickly become very much like the thing you are trying to destroy. And for me, when I look at Jesus in the Gospels, and this is where, say myself and Jacob, I'm sure he's listening, Jacob the Jew, or myself and Jacob sort of differ on Jesus. Jacob is much more frustrated with Jesus, because I look at Jesus as sort of recognizing the mimetic rivalry with Rome and saying, I'm not listening, Jacob says. Come on, Jacob, you're just waiting for me to name you. You were. That Jesus sort of steps out of the mimetic rivalry and basically says, I am going to deal with you in a way that you are completely unprepared for. And Jonathan, well, we should definitely get to Jonathan Pageau, because his journey is also very interesting. But John Vervaeke's, what you said, what you opened up with T.S. Eliot is just so true. That, my end is my beginning. That people, it's very difficult for us to ever finally leave home, and in some ways, all of our struggles continue to be with our home. And so in terms of John Vervaeke's quest, that is certainly part of it. I mean, if in fact he hasn't never given details, which I think is absolutely appropriate, but if in fact the type of fundamentalism that he grew up with, like many fundamentalisms that arose in the late 19th, early 20th century, is sort of this anti-science fundamentalism. John is in that sense a scientific fundamentalist, but certainly not in sort of the reductionist way that Sam Harris thinks he is. So,
and importantly, there's that implied belief in reconciliation, that implied belief, faith in the other, that he is constantly trying to, restate, make sure is understood, that that's his posture and his stance. A little less so in Jordan Peterson. I think Jordan Peterson has a good heart in the end. Obviously, it's a very much a passion of genuine effort to help people, to be a positive force, but a little less formed, a little less, I don't know, clear as to where that path might end up.
Yeah. Well, should we have we finished with John? Should we pivot to Pageau?
Sure. Yeah.
So Odysseus as Pageau, that's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, just because it, in a way, I see Odysseus as not ultimately transformed by his experience. He's still the thing that he is, and he ends up home in a real way. And I don't think we have to say that the move from whatever his formation was to the Orthodox means that he sees that himself, as having that kind of exile or transformation away from whatever it was that it was there. There's something essential there that was always there, I think, in a certain sense. And that's how I see him. I think he's what's the right way to think about him? One of the main things that was attractive to me about Jonathan Pageau in the beginning was his ultimate pointing to an elevation of the kind of substantialness of our phenomenal experience. And for me, that's important because it allows for a kind of a circumstance of not rejecting the immanent of our experience, the kind of the way we're in the world. And his way of talking about the ability to engage and really come in contact with these patterns that he's regularly referring to, we're experiencing those in our real incarnate life, and therefore it makes for the possibility of kind of deeply meaningful habitation in the world as we are. We find ourselves. And I don't know how that connects with quest for a spiritual home, but that's kind of the way. That was one of the main things that attracted me to him. And I see a lot of that in T.S. Eliot. He talks about T.S. Eliot is not a symbol. He doesn't like symbols, but not in the way that Jonathan Pageau uses symbols. T.S. Eliot uses a term called the objective correlative. And what he means by that is that, when we see a rose or a beautiful flower, it is the manifestation of beauty of that transcendent. So the transcendent is in the immanent. It's nested in the immanent, if you will, and it's fully available to us. We have direct access to it, if you will, and so when he uses imagery in his poetry, he's bringing in things, wanting us to notice that fact that, that if you want to know, you can describe a rose, fragility, it's got thorns. You can describe abstractly what, maybe talk about how that's kind of evoking some sort of transcendent notion of frail, transient beauty. But that's all secondary. That's all a reconstruction of the primary experience of the rose that's right in front of you. So in a way, I see Pageau. Here's my dog going off.
All right.
I see Pageau kind of trying to do a similar kind of thing. He's trying to make us realize that we could be comfortable in our phenomenal experience, recognize the way things are, and have them have the fullest meaning that they have in our direct encounter with them. I don't know if
I think that's really good.
Not,
I think that's really helpful. I'm not really familiar with Eliot, even though many people have been. Oh, you got to read T.S. Eliot.
There will be an opportunity that Ralph Fiennes has done a roadshow in England where he reads 4 quartets. And he's now, I think, with his sister, producing a version of it that's going to be coming out within probably the next 6 months.
Oh,
and
wow.
It should be an interesting way to experience 4 quartets. But anyway.
But no, I think you really nailed a lot of Pageau's project. And it's interesting that he comes at it from a different way than Eliot, but in many ways, a very similar quest. And I think in terms of Pageau's biography, one of the problems that we have with us as human beings is we're only sort of getting to talk to one small arc of the story. He's fine. It's not
So,
really that loud
yeah. Okay.
coming
Okay.
through.
Very good.
So we only get to sort of see one small arc of the story with every individual human being, and especially for someone like Jonathan. On one hand, we are all individuals, but we are also nested in. I mean, this is part of what's coming down the road now too. You see this in Michael Levin's work when we're looking at each of us as individuals is sort of like looking at one act of a 3-act play. That my father's story is nested in me, my mother's story, my grandfather's story. I mean, there's all these stories that are nested and formed in me. And so even just talking to me now gets the instantiation of Paul Vanderklay nearing 60, which would be a different instantiation of him nearing 30, let's say. So Pageau has found a way, I think, to access a far broader picture and be able to bring that into view. I But yet still he is still nested in this narrative of French Canadian to evangelical. There was obviously his missionary work in Congo, which was deeply formative in making him into who he is. And now, of course, this YouTube instantiation, or even it could wind up being more of a publishing instantiation. And his goal in this, which has been he's found a way to give people a picture of the one and the many, and of the accessibility and availability of these patterns, in the phenomenological. And I think for him, in some ways, his path to orthodoxy was, I think that's really true, and Odysseus like in terms of his path to home. And yeah, it's really interesting though, because orthodoxy has within it both sort of a mere Christianity aspect and also a deep exclusivism. I mean, the more I've gotten to know the Orthodox among us, and I obviously Orthodox is sort of a single and plural word. We don't say the Orthodoxes or the Orthodoxies. We could say that, but you've got some Orthodox who are demanding rebaptism, and you've got other Orthodox who don't. You have some Orthodox that sort of adopt this mere Christianity posture, and you have some Orthodox that basically say, if you're not in an Orthodox church, you're not in the real church. But then you're going to have, well, but if you're a Ukrainian in the Russian Orthodox church, and if your two nations are fighting, so
yeah,
those.
Well, I don't know what you'd comment on. I don't get the feeling that those issues rise to concern for Pageau. I mean,
No, they don't. He's
obviously
very much in the mere Christianity Orthodox camp.
Yeah, I won't do this, but I can deconstruct the history of the Orthodox Church and come up with some fairly unattractive elements to that deconstruction of that history. And but that, I don't know how important that is.
No, Jay Dyer out there in YouTube land, I haven't watched hardly any of it, partly because I am so inside kind of the mere Christianity camp that even within my own Christian Reformed circles, I find the antithetical people who just want to really dig down into just what is and isn't common grace, and if we should allow any of it anymore. I just don't really spend much time there because I find it uninteresting.
Yeah, and that might get to, I don't know, might get to my own take on a lot of these things.
We should talk about Verdonk before we get to you. You're
Okay.
going to be the
You're
going to be the climax of this,
No, I
Dr.
don't know
Jim,
about that. I
because
don't know
the
about
personal
that.
is always the climax. It really is. In an
Yeah, that's
estuary
true.
meeting,
Okay.
you
Yep.
know you arrive when
Mhm.
people, now I want to talk about this abstract thing over here. And then suddenly they disclose something intimate, and
True.
the room hushes because
Mhm.
we know, well, now we're in the holy place.
Yep.
So, but the one, of course, Pageau is a big draw to these conferences, and Pageau sort of gets, people people really need to see Pageau, and some people really need to see John. Not so me so much. And of course, John Verdonk, a lot of people, well, he's organizing the conference, but it's Verdonk who really, in many ways, has skin in the game in this conference. And if far fewer people have watched my biographical conversation with Verdonk, but his story is deeply in this, because of course, I'll just run through some of the snapshots. He comes from a broken home. His mother, for a while he was put into a residential school because there was concern that his mother couldn't quite handle things, and his father abandoned the family. And so when he tells his story, he talks a lot about being fathered. He eventually had some reconciliation with his father when his father was old, but John Verdonk, in many ways, as a boy and as a young man, was adrift. And Verdonk is an interesting character because he, in fact, of course, he leaves the Netherlands and goes to Canada he had been working in dairies in the Netherlands. And then he goes to Canada to work in dairies in Western Canada. And it was supposed to be sort of an educational thing, but the Canadian government messed up his visa and gave him a permanent visa instead of an educational visa.
I
And
remember the story.
so,
Yeah.
and he's not a Christian at all. And then he realizes very quickly that all of the really wealthy dairymen in Western Canada are Dutch and go to the Christian Reformed Church. So, schemer that he is, he decides he's going to start infiltrating the Christian Reformed Church so he can get in good with these wealthy dairymen. And he does that, and he finds himself suddenly, now suddenly there's church and there's God and there's all of these pieces. He's gonna wait till he hears I told his story. He's gonna freak out. And so then he becomes a Christian, and then he wants to be a minister. And so then he has to figure out how to get himself to Calvin College to get a degree, and he meets a woman there, and he eventually will get married, and he goes to seminary, and then he's into church planting, and he's in pastoring, and by his own admission, terrible church planter, not a terribly effective pastor, just can't always keep himself from saying the wrong things, the things that are really on his mind. And then at some point, his wife is getting an advanced degree, and so he sort of puts ministry on pause to raise their 3 daughters. And then she leaves him, and he's a single mother or single father. And his life is a wreck. And again, another church steps in, the church that we are gathering in, and sort of puts their arms around him and says, we don't care what crazy ideas you have about propositional theology. You're one of us. And of course, he goes to a Richard Rohr event where he sort of has to go out on some kind of a vision quest, and the whole fatherhood thing sort of gets put into a package for him. And an aging psychiatrist in that church says, I spent my whole life working, trying to address the damage of broken homes and fatherlessness. Why don't I give you a kind of a ad hoc job to be pro fathers and go out in the world and do what you can in this mess. And so he's, John will never be an elder at his church because he's heretical in a variety of ways, and he'll never be a minister again. And his story is all over the place, but what he's always longed for, just like we began with, is, his end is his beginning. And this fatherlessness that he felt very acutely all along the way, and in some ways always looking for fathers, always actually being fathered, sometimes by dairymen taking him into their home, putting a place at the table and saying to everyone in the room, that's John's place. He belongs here. I mean, so even though John doesn't make videos or anything, Quest for a Spiritual Home, that's John Van Donk's story. And now he's in his 70s. And so
wow.
Go
wow.
ahead.
Well, I'd say, that brings in the dimension of the ecclesial, the community, and kind of absent from the thinking that I was spinning out before. And it's obviously very important, and it trumps a lot of the other stuff, right? And that's powerful. And I did listen to him with you conversing about that. And that, what comes to mind on that is the power of the absolutely personal story, because I don't want to do anything with that story besides, kind of honor it as his, his personal reality. And that, I would assume, gives you a great opportunity to be, to know who he is and be with him when you've been together, or when you've talked, I assume.
Well, when you say the power of the personal story,
yep.
That is John's mission.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole estuary thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he talks about this myopic mental meanderings. I mean, all the thinky-talky stuff we do for John Van Donk, it doesn't get real until someone sits down and discloses and says, and enters into this space of vulnerability.
hey.
and enters into this space of vulnerability and goes into this group of mostly strangers.
keep talking. I'm going to take care of this real quick. Sorry.
All right, no problem. And enters into this place of vulnerability, and then suddenly someone who was a total stranger in the room, surrounded by mostly strangers, starting to become friends, then they say, this is who I am. And in a sense, all of those vulnerability questions, this is who I am. Do you dare to love me? Can I, through your eyes, imagine myself as someone lovable? The video I did with the Mueller on ContraPoints was very interesting, because, of course, ContraPoints says, I don't believe in any of this ontological stuff. All I want to know is, am I attractive? And for ContraPoints, of course, as a woman, am I desirable? And it's humans are such subtle creatures. We have a whole generation of women out there on one hand saying, don't desire me for how I look. Well, that's some of the population. A lot of the rest of the population are dying to be desired for how they look. And that one woman, as a young woman who didn't want to be desired for how she looks, now suddenly in her old age says, I'm no longer desired for how I look. And so we're creatures with this very very sensitive core.
Wow. I do think that's an interest. That's kind of opens my eyes to a little bit more of what he might be up to there, in terms of creating a space, creating an environment in which that's, kind of facilitated and made genuine and not in the form, let's say, of demanding approval from impersonal other populations, but rather personal and direct encounter. That's a dimension of a spiritual home that has to be a part of what we're doing for sure. I'm looking forward to what he says. I'm looking forward to what he says a lot, actually.
Well, he might complain that I make him sound better than he makes himself sound, but
well, it's a real life. It's a real life.
Yeah, but there's in some ways we can see each other better than we see ourselves, so that's always an issue. But for John Vervaeke, this ecology of practices, of course, in a fundamentalist space, your ecology is very ostensibly. Now, I've been in enough fundamentalist places to know that they're not quite as narrow and consistent as they imagine they are. But in a fundamentalist place, the entire game is, we don't move the boundaries. These are the boundaries. And, I'm going to, you're going to pry that out of my cold, dead hands. That's sort of the clasp of fundamentalism. And so John's sort of, no, we need to, it's the horizontal. We need to continue to go out into the horizon, and this can be refined, and this can be known, and this can be pursued. And so in many ways, John Vervaeke is all moving outward. Jonathan Pageau is in some ways elliptical, because like Odysseus, it's an elliptical journey.
Yep.
And Odysseus doesn't necessarily change that much, but he's, when he gets back to Penelope, he needs to reestablish home. His wife is under assault. His son is, everything's in jeopardy on Ithaca. And in that sense, Pageau, fits that mold. For John Van Donk, it's in some ways, we're holding this in a church again, and I'm preaching in that church. And so when I think about the sermon, churches want to, and this might enter into, some of your thoughts about yourself, churches want to sort of, in this meaning crisis, put out a welcome home sign. Because especially in modernity, especially in America, especially in the West, where you have all of this movement out into a strange land, churches want to say, and sometimes can, we are the home you've always wanted. We are the home you're looking for. And of course, those who are most hungry for home might, take the bait and have a profound sense of disappointment. For some people, and as a pastor, I think we have to be fair to churches on both sides. For some, churches do become the home they've always longed for, and they do in church find rest for their souls. And I think we have a lot of stories out there of disappointment and disenchantment with church that leads to a reputation that churches always miss. If churches always missed, there wouldn't be so many of them. Churches seldom completely satisfy, and when they do, it's usually for a season. But the whole question, especially of church and temple, which it follows, is very much a quest for home. So, this, and so then for John Van Donk, he's, I've been the one that's called, I'd take him, I'd visit him down in Southern California, and he'd always talk to me like, that's their church. And then I'd be with him in that church, and I watched how they talked to him, and I watched how they defer to him, and I watched how much responsibility had been given. I said, you're not gonna bullshit me on this, John. They love you here. This is your home. You've got angst with your home, but nobody fights harder for this place than you. Pastors come and pastors go, but this is your home. And I know it, and the people here know it. You just don't want to admit that to yourself or to others. So
that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, I like that image of him. I like hearing that. Yeah, that's good. I'm really looking forward to meeting him. And I've heard him talk. I feel that in when he talks, so let's see what else.
Well, what about me? I want to hear you do me. I'm curious because again, we can't see ourselves, and so my sister, she's never going to listen to this, so I can say it. My sister has a YouTube channel, and every time she reads all the comments, every time she gets a negative comment, it's like crushing. And I want to say, get off YouTube, because the bigger you get, the worse it's going to get. And I don't know. Maybe it was because, my mother loved me so well or something. Negative comments don't bother me. I kind of like them. So
I don't think I'm going to have anything negative to say about you, Paul. Because I consider you my pastor, and so I'm not going to. I like everything about you, Paul. But let me.
Certainly don't know me well enough.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe that's it. I guess I would say, I just talk out loud about what I think.
Yeah.
You look to me like a guy who's very committed to, kind of real, important, high stakes things that you have had deep roots in, let's say, demands made upon you to live up to those realities, and want to do that, obviously. I mean, and are committed to doing those things in the face of real evolution in thinking, real, kind of bumping into realities as at the role that you're in, that that have some dissonance, let's say, with that core. But that core is still the thing that you would sacrifice for. And perhaps sacrificing for that means kind of grappling with these dissonances and realizing they're not going to resolve. But that does not mean that you're going to bail or kind of, I don't know, do whatever it is, go out on a walkabout or whatever. So that's, I feel that about you, that's your, that's your work, let's say. And I don't know if that looks right or not.
That does sound right. When I started on the video thing, and when I did a deep dive into Keller, I was just blogging. There was no YouTube. When I did a deep dive into Keller, that wasn't so dangerous, because Tim Keller and the Christian Reformed Church, Tim Keller is in some ways sort of a perfection of half of the Christian Reformed Church. But when I decided to do a deep dive into Peterson, I very much wanted C.S. Lewis to be my Virgil, because I knew I was going to go on a journey, and I knew I wanted a guide, and I thought Lewis can be a really helpful guide for me through this, because I definitely saw resonance between Peterson and Lewis in some ways. And but there are I am at my core in many ways a missionary, and there are risks in this journey. But I, at the same time, at this stage in life, it's a good stage in life to go on a journey. Journeys are in some senses for young men before their fathers, and for old men once the kids are grown. That middle section with the kids at home. No, that's
where you're at. Yeah, for sure.
That's where you really have to be. So, and I often feel, I often have to deal with some of my own anxieties and insecurities in these things, because, Pageau is just breaking ground, and you just watch him breaking ground. Yeah. And Vervaeke is, he's so well
bold, kind of bold.
Yes.
And
yes. The guy knows so much, and he's read everything, and he continues to read more. And And sometimes I just want to get on stage and say, ah, shucks, I'm just a pastor here, fellas.
Yeah.
I haven't read as many books as you all. And
Hmm.
I certainly, I certainly can't sort of see through things like Pageau can. And I don't have the kind of breadth of understanding that Vervaeke does. But I hope I can, in some ways, do what a pastor does, which is hopefully do what I can to create a space where people will flourish. Because that's really the job of a pastor, to sort of create a space where people can flourish. And that flourishing is not, I think in our current cultural imagination, we imagine that flourishing is always a pleasant thing, and it by no means, it seldom is.
Yeah. That's obviously that's good work. It's important thing to be doing. I do that, with patients. It's a lot of what I do is trying to be with people in in difficult circumstances. Not always difficult though, but serious circumstances, let's say, and trying to be something for them, both in terms of what they might imagine about me, but also in true kind of direct connection with them, uh, to somehow be therapeutics, to be supportive and be present. And it's not always the same. Everybody kind of needs something different. It's not necessarily about kind of some correct choice of a medicine or some understanding that you have about a disease process or whatever. It's about connecting and giving the best you can, confidence and love in the end is the right word for that.
Yeah.
And it's it's like, I'm sure in a lot of ways, it's like your experience. It's very much an encounter with a real particular person who's very different than you are, and you're trying to figure it out. You're trying to understand what is the best relationship to build with them, if you will. And it's in small. I don't get the opportunity to be in depth with every one of my patients, of course, but some I do. Some I've known for many years, and it's very important to try to be the best you can be for them in that way.
Why cardiology and not general practice? How did that go for you?
Because it was more fun.
Ah.
It's it's a combination of kind of technical stuff. There's a lot of technology, and I enjoy that. I kind of have a science / physics background that makes me enjoy that kind of stuff. How certain imaging techniques work and that kind of stuff. But it's also procedural, so you get to use tactile stuff and learn procedures and get good at them and feel confident in them. And then it's also this kind of direct patient care. So it's got a wide variety of ways of interacting with people and with medicine. And that's really how I ended up there. But it was also people. I found people who I respected and I wanted to be like them. And so, hey, that drives you,
Well, and is heart disease the #1 killer of North Americans?
Hard to go out of business being a cardiologist.
I didn't mean it that way. I mean, you're in a sense, I don't want to say anything about podiatrists. That would make me, but for the most part, I've not, although then again, gangrene, diabetes, I've had people in church who've had foot concerns. And so their podiatrists are very much where the front line is. But more often than not, it's congestive heart failure, it's heart disease, it's stroke. And so,
it's, obviously I was tempted by, I felt the pull of being in that kind of important place, being the one responsible and trying to build to the point where I would be confident in that place. And the the respect that you get in that kind of circumstance is very attractive. And it's got its difficulty over the long haul. It's hard to compete with, somebody having a heart attack in the hospital. And so my kids or my wife, it's pretty hard to say, no, I don't want you to go in. So,
all right.
Or I've got some,
let the neighbor die then.
So, but it's not necessarily that serious all the time. I don't want to be making that seem that way, but it does kind of raise that level of, creates a gap between you and people to some degree, that, just constantly working on and dealing with. But that I've settled into that now. I'm late in my career. I'm very, very comfortable with what I do, and a lot of, again, fun in my work. I like the relationships. I like the variability, the variety of things I get to do. I work with technology and computers and software, as well as patients and all that stuff. And I really enjoy pretty much all of it now. I don't think that has, in a weird way, I don't think that has a lot to do with my my journey. If what we're talking about is this spiritual home question. Although maybe, I think I told you the story maybe way back at the beginning. I come from a very secular place in my upbringing. My parents were, their families were Methodists. They met at a Methodist college, so the religion wasn't foreign to them at all. But it just didn't end up being part of their lives as we were growing up, and it wasn't really part of all mine and my siblings' lives, really. And in a way that makes me, I think, significantly different than a lot of people in this corner, it wasn't a problematic space. My parents were devoted to each other. There was a very clear ethos, I think, that was built around mostly my father and his, kind of respect for responsibility, for taking care of your family, for trying to achieve something beyond just something straightforward, that education was the vehicle for that, that, financial security was a goal that was a responsibility that you had. You needed to do that. And education was the vehicle for doing that. And, commitment to family. And my parents stayed together and are presently living in Denver. And I just visited them last week, doing well, living, together, and are pretty healthy despite being 96 and 93. Wow. And so that's a, they're obviously getting older, obviously, but doing pretty well, frankly. Yeah. Planting flowers and hoping for the spring, and so that kind of setup, that kind of starting point is not really anything like the transformation that I was talking about with John Vervaeke. And my Christian faith, actually, I think is it comes from that. That is to say, it comes from that not being what a lot of people, I think of when they, in this corner, particularly when they talk about, let's say, the secular world as something that's kind of intrinsically nihilistic, intrinsically fraught with the relativism, intrinsically a road to perdition, and the only, and it's got that as its, center, and some sort of notion that you can't form a ethical kind of framework in that kind of environment without a kind of an absolutist belief in God and the Bible as the source of those things. That's just not part of my experience. And so it's not something that I resonate with. I think it is possible to do those things because I saw it. And so that does affect the way I think about, my Christian faith, because I came to my Christian faith in a kind of a different way, I was a seeker in a certain sense. I had a kind of a transition into adulthood that was very common, a kind of, J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye kind of alienation moment as a young man. And I I, that was very fraught and full of anxiety and alienation. But I had some skills and capabilities, so I wasn't going to flounder. But I definitely felt that, and I reached out for things to essentially mirror that experience for me. And this is not an uncommon thing, certainly in the 70s when I grew up. Music, figures like, I would just give you the flavor of the kind of guy I was. Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, reggae. That kind of thing, Woody Allen at the time. That Woody Allen, not the way we think of Woody Allen now.
No, he's very different.
Very different now. But back then, he was a kind of a voice of the era in a real serious way, and I did, I resonated with some of that. But it wasn't about being transformed. I wasn't looking to become something else. I was looking for someone to resonate, to reflect back my own experience, to show me that I wasn't isolated in the way I was feeling, and to give voice to it in a more complex way with a more complex vocabulary, etc. And so, then I kind of go to high culture. If we count Neil Young as low culture, we'll go to high culture and see, Shakespeare and Hamlet. Really, as a young man, it was somehow that kind of, I didn't know what I was looking at, frankly, but somehow that felt right. It felt like he was speaking for me in some sense. And I constantly was looking for that. I wasn't looking for someone to make me different than I was. I was looking for something to dramatize, to enact, to be, to use a Christian term the way I understand it, to be sacramental, to embody it in community for me and have it feel real to me. But it comes from the direct experience that I was having. And then I take, Shakespeare as Hamlet's better than something else. And then ultimately I came around to the Christian framework as, as kind of being more complete, as being more full, being more rich, being maybe the source and origin for a lot of these things I had already kind of bumped into as possibilities, to the point where I came, a few steps past Tom Holland here and just ready to say, I regard it as true. That seems to be the case to me. And it doesn't let me down, but it's not, again, it's not, I guess I want to say it something like, I don't want it to be a transformative thing because I want it to be in my experience. I want it to be in my experience. I want it to be my experience. And that experience is the whole arc of my life. And I don't want to believe in being born again. Now that I know that sounds kind of, I don't know where that's going to fit with how you might talk about things, but
well, it should be born from above, because that's born again really is not a good translation.
There you go.
Born from above. I think maybe I'm okay with that. born from above is a little closer to what you're talking about.
Yeah. I don't resonate with psychedelics in this sense. I don't want to have it be some momentary experience. I mean, it's not that I don't want momentary experiences. I do want momentary experience of exaltation and sublimity and all that, but it has to be the whole thing. It can't just be, I'm looking for some moment of it's got to be bigger than that. It's got to be all inclusive. And I don't know if that might still be a bit abstract in terms of
I don't think it's abstract myself, at all.
But that's where I'm at.
What I hear is you. I mean, I think in some ways you were formed by peak Protestant Christendom. Protestant Christendom in Europe didn't really, struggled partly because you have all of these tiny little nations in the, second, in the last 500 years, and they're just flopping back and forth. The Netherlands can't decide if it wants to be Roman Catholic or Reformed, and then of course the Reformed are always splintering. But when you look at, let's say, the civilization that achieved the United Nations and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and you look at the civilization that sort of produced kind of the turn from the confessional, the varied confessional stances of all the little colleges out east into sort of the emerging humanities that came, and especially with your cogency with respect to, let's say, the Western canon. And for you, that not only includes Shakespeare, it also includes Westerns.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so what I hear you saying is something to the point of you in a sense happily inhabited this. I think in some ways it was sort of that moment of, when you're climbing the hill, you have so much momentum, you get this one point where you just sort of get lift off at the end of the hill, until of course you start to go down the other side. And I think in some ways that was the climax of this particular narrative arc of Western civilization at the, sort of in the middle of the 20th century, where the human Christianity Protestant Christianity in America sort of reached a settlement place until, of course, then the movement of the counterculture says not enough, and challenged idols within it.
I don't think I express myself fully, though, if I don't go to a little bit more of a admission of a kind of dissonance that I have in my Christian faith, and I kind of want to describe myself as a postmodern Christian, and I don't know if that's a good characterization, but I'll give you a little rundown here. Just real quick to set this up, I want to tell about a witness, a testimony that a friend of mine gave just recently, and it's a very standard one. He's in a recovery program, and he invited me to go to his testimony, and he tells what you might imagine a very difficult story of being born when his father was in jail, being the oldest of 4 kids, and being given the responsibility to try to take care of those kids in a dysfunctional family where there were drugs and alcohol and some degree of conflict and even violence. And he feels that he failed his siblings because he was responsible for them. But of course, he was only 15. And how could he possibly do that? And then he gets older and he just recapitulates that in his adulthood. And it is a big disaster. And it's a very difficult story that he tells. And then he has, kind of a bottom out experience. And in that moment of that bottom out experience, he describes Jesus coming to him directly. He describes a very direct, real experience of Jesus coming into his life, into his backyard, and lifting him out of this. And he then his life is transformed, and he becomes it takes time. His life is transformed. He becomes a different person. He becomes a Christian. He becomes a leader in these programs. He describes himself as bringing Jesus to these people and saving their lives. And there's no real, that's the story he tells. It's very profound and it's very real. And I set that up because I'm going to tell another story about myself. And this is going to sound a little weird, and I hope it doesn't. I hope I'll try to keep it short. But I'm going to tell a story. It's a parable. It's about my brother. My brother lives in Portland, Maine, and I kind of keep in touch with my brother, but I don't know what's going on with him. He's on the other side of the country, and so if I start with a kind of kind of direct experience kind of notion, I really have no knowledge of what's going on with my brother. Here I'm now doing a kind of dime store version of the development of the modern. Okay. Sense experience is all we know. I know nothing about my brother. This is inductive reasoning. This is bottom up. This is, epistemology of the empirical type. But of course, that's not really true. I do know about what's going on with my brother. My brother lives in the same kind of world that I do, and it has kind of metaphysical constraints to it. And therefore, I know he's living in that world. There's one world, it's one way, and he's living in those constraints. And that's a kind of deductive logic. It's a principle that defines what the particulars are going to be. And that means that my brother is bound up in that same metaphysical experience. Just to put a point on this, to make it clear, it's a little quirky, but I know that my brother is not levitating. And I know that because in my world, levitation doesn't happen. And I'm not talking about some trick, some trick with magnets or something. I'm talking about levitating. And so I know that. So that's a kind of, that's the rationalist view. That's the world is ordered. The world is one way. But now we come into the problem, because my brother calls me up and he says, "You're wrong, Jim. I do levitate." And now I'm like, but I'm seeing him live this out. I'm seeing him insist. I'm seeing him teach his children about this. I'm seeing it affect even some people in my life. And now I have to kind of look at my brother and say, what is going on with my brother? And there's some options. He's joking. He's being cynical. He's lying, or we could say he's a liar, or he's insane, or he's ignorant. And then the real question comes is, what is my posture relative to my brother? What am I going to do with this situation? Because there's one thing I'm not going to do, and that is change the metaphysics of the world. I am, the way the world is the way the world is. And then I can phrase that in a kind of Pageauing way for me. That is to say, for me, the kind of, Jonathan talks about this, like the solar system view of the solar system is nested in the flat earth, right? I'm going to the phenomenal experience. I'm going to stretch that to the objective is nested in the subjective. But the thing that I don't know that Pageau emphasizes enough is that the objective, in it being nested in the subjectives, remains objective. That is to say, it sits in the subjective as the objective, meaning it's not modifiable by my sense of things, by my desires about things. I can't, it's immutable that's the point about it, in fact, is that it's immutable. And so one of the things I can't do with my brother is say, oh yeah, all right, well, I guess you do levitate. That's not really a possibility. The rest of the possibilities are unpleasant. I can argue with my brother. I can try to make a case, do a PowerPoint and try to convince him that he doesn't levitate. I could reject him. I could exile him. I could feel myself superior to him. And I could, talk with my buds about how immature and unworthy my brother is. And that's in the end, the position that kind of, I think we're in this is what I meant by postmodern, where we are embedded in our own subjectivity, and that kind of relativity notion in postmodern is real, I think, but it's also got this character of a gap between us and our fellows. And this gentleman that I talked about, this friend of mine who talked about his experience and the woo of his encounter with Jesus, for me, that is levitating. And that's, that's a gap between me and him. And I can do these things that I was just talking about with my brother. I can think, well, we could do we can call it psychology or something like that. But all those things don't get at what, the question is how, for me, this is a real tension for me, but it's something I think I've come to, I don't know, I wouldn't say comfort because it's not comfortable. I'll just give you another example of this in my own Christian faith. For me, it is an objective fact that the book of Daniel was written sometime between the year 200 and the year 150 AD. That's an objective fact for me. And I can't see it in any other way than that.
Mm-hmm.
And that has all those implications that I'm sure you're well aware of as to
Yep.
what that means
Yep.
about how I look at the text of the Bible,
Yep.
what it might be for the text to be inspired, maybe even what my attitude about miracles is, and all sorts of other things.
Yep.
I go to a church where I don't think there's one person in that church who would agree with me on the dating of the book of Daniel. And I don't know what the world of Christianity is and what they say about this issue, but it is the way my Christian faith pays itself out, is that I'm in that community.
Yeah.
And I want to be in that community.
Yeah.
But one of the things I can't do, and one I do think, just for, I don't know, there is a moral reality that says we should not live in dissonance with that which is objective for us. We should not, the world is for us a way, and we need to be, in a certain sense, comfortable in that. And so living in dissonance with that, for me, is not an option. But it's also coming to a kind of maturity about, I don't know exactly how I want to. Well, frankly, with this friend I talked about, I don't even want to talk about this stuff. The reality of what happened to him is profound, and it is not to be touched or, kind of denigrated or disrespected. So anyway, that's where, I don't know, what do you have to say about that? That's me.
Well, you're certainly not alone.
Right. There you go. Yeah. So yeah, I wonder, I tell this long, elaborate thing, and it's just a common thing. It's like,
no, I think you're a minority in the church, as you just described.
Yes.
But you're certainly not alone.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
And there's this tension that you feel is more common than your particular stance with respect to the rest of your church. That's more common, because that scales. I think that scales all the way out, and it scales on various different axes. I know, and these, I've made some videos lately, and there'll be more coming out. We're reaching peak. We're reaching peak Christian Reformed season soon.
Yes.
When Synod starts, I'm probably going to be doing commentaries, because Synod's on YouTube, and so because I'm not a synodical delegate, I can pull out salient speeches and say, everybody's just watching, it's a blah, 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 blah. But it's going to be, when I watched it, it's like, that person said that thing here, that means this is coming. So, that's my area of expertise, as it were. But with respect to your, when you talk about your friend and his speech, and the reason that you can't and you won't, in some ways, sort of, what that person's story is holy.
Absolutely.
And you recognize that, and you sort of, what we do with our lives with respect to the holy is we sort of put it in a space so that we can, in some ways, avoid it. Now, that sounds really weird coming from a pastor, which is supposed to be drawing people towards the holy. But if you look at what the holy is, nobody goes into the Holy of Holies. One guy once a year, whether he likes it or not. And so those, so you've got you in your church in this other larger frame. and you at least have the decency, the love, and I think the good sense to look at your friend's story and sort of be hushed by it. But all of the dissonance that you feel, just like with your brother levitating, I think in some ways, oh gosh, how to talk about this stuff. It's so hard. In some ways, that's our most human, quintessential thing about being human, that we bump up into the holy. And have you ever read much Frederick Buechner?
No.
Do you know who he
No.
is?
Mm-mm.
Oh gosh. He was a mainline. I think you'd really like him. He was a mainline Christian writer. You should start. He's got some really famous books, but to me, my favorite book of his is called Lion Country. And it's a story about a man. It's hard to get the book by its now. Now you get it sort of in Book of Beb with all of his Beb books. Beb
Mhm.
is a pastor who lives in untourist Florida, who has a diploma mill, and he both is rumored to have once, he's a faith healer, and he's both rumored to have once raised the dead and gone to jail for child molestation. So,
I just found that book. Yeah.
yeah, the Book of Beb. And so there's a journalist from the city who decides that he's going to go. I'm going to give away some spoilers here, but the book is still very worth reading. He's going to go down and expose this guy for who he is, because quite clearly, no one raises the dead. The child molestation is easily believable, and the diploma mill is exactly what we would expect. And so he goes down to Florida, and he winds up having a relationship with Beb's daughter, who sort of equal to the journalist, is trying to sort of live in this space, just like you described, of, your brother levitating and your good friend meeting Jesus in the backyard. And, what Buechner winds up doing so well is sort of leaving that holy space as holy, because there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is my version of kind of what I was trying to talk about as postmodern, in the sense that whole thing puts a moral demand on us. It puts a moral demand on us as to how we're going to treat each other, how, not even just treat each other, what our attitude is going to be. Again, am I going to exile my brother? And the answer is no. I am not going to exile my brother. But that's a moral thing. And it's a moral thing that stands in the face of some idea, that maybe creates, I don't know, some dissonance. But how important is the idea? And that's, that's something that colors my faith. And I mean, it makes me, kind of come up with these propositions that that are part of my faith. And I'm a kind of a radically non-confessional kind of person. I see in the history of the church, and even in the present church, that confessionalism just is usually a problem. Is usually destructive, and I don't know that the scripture really argues in favor of it. But I'm a conformist. I go to this church, and I'm a member, and I try to be in communion with. I try to be in communion with that confession. So it's a little bit of a kind of a tension, a conflict. Not a tension. It's not a tension. A way in which I can say both of those things at once. I can say I don't know that idea structure tends to trump these other things. Faith is higher than theology. This is how I
The
put it together.
relationship you have with your friend and your brother is holy in a
Right.
way. It's not holy like your stance with respect to the levitating or the Jesus in the backyard, but
It's self-sacrificial in a certain way.
yes, yeah,
It's saying, I know the world is one way. It's one way for me, and I know that's the way it is.
yeah,
but that's not going to drive what I do, how I love people.
yeah.
So,
Well, and and I look in the story of David and Absalom,
mhm,
and in that story, the Absalom story, of course, gets going with a rape. Um, you know, Absalom's half brother rapes Absalom's sister, and David does nothing. And you see this tension growing and growing and growing, and it finally breaks out in the murder of one of David's sons, and David still does nothing. And then, of course, Absalom then begins to start a coup.
rise
And
up.
before you know it, there's a civil war, and David's mighty men aren't going to have it. So they finally, take matters into their own hands, like they've done time and time again for David. And in a very bloody and brutal way, put down this revolt. And of course, David has told his mighty men, don't touch that boy Absalom. And so, right there, it's obviously not the same kind of tension that you feel with the levitation or Jesus in the backyard, but it's these things that we bump up into where we know the holy. And part of what secularity said is holiness is just a part of religion, until, of course, you start reading Shakespeare and T.S. Eliot and authors who are atheist and authors who are not, and you begin bumping into the holy all over the place. So then you suddenly have the problem in pluralism. Wait a minute. How on earth do we deal with the holy?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so
So
that somehow, somehow that's a picture of what my spiritual home would be. That's not.
that's exactly why you belong in this little
Yeah.
corner. I mean, because if there's
Oh, totally.
if there's anything that's true of the, poor Trip Parker on Twitter always sort of shakes his head at me like, Vander Clay, you're just a magnet for heretics. And
And that might be another one, but it does allow me that, being here, and I don't know why it's persisted. Well, mainly because of you, I think, but because I could have easily drifted off along the way, but haven't. And I think it's mostly because of you, but it allows me to, I don't know that I was ever, there's lots of reasons why I'm still a part of that church and go beyond just what I've talked about, but it allows me to be there in a healthier way. It allows me to love and know and be with those people in exactly the right way, exactly the way that I should be.
Yeah.
And so that's a positive. That's a good thing. And then I can come over here and, kind of express myself. And it's a lot of depth and reality to living. And I don't know. That's the end of that sentence, I guess.
well, and I think for me, it's very much the same. The Christian Reformed Church is in this existential fight right now. And, for me, the Christian Reformed Church has always been, on one hand, part of the Christian Reformed Church is this strict.
Let me just step in one little comment, because, John Verdonk said that he wanted the quest part of this in there. And the part of that I think is you may be getting at here, and I've maybe been talking about as well. Another thing about this is that the whole story here, the neighborhood of this problem of a spiritual home, is that has has high stakes.
Yes.
And kind of encased in that, or embodied in that notion of quest.
Yes.
It's not just, being part of the local fandom of the football club or whatever. This is, however you ultimately define the end point or the metaphysical structure you put on it, it's always high stakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
no, and it is for me, because I mean, Phlebas is probably watching, and Phlebas is Christian Reformed, and Phlebas has told me, said, Paul, I really wanted you to be the great apologist for the Christian Reformed Church that would go out and multiply the Christian Reformed Church into the world, and I have certainly not achieved that. And so for me, part of, while on one hand the cake is baked and the core is there, and I am high in openness, another part of me is also kind of, a father of the estuary, where when we gather these people who come into the church building for an estuary meeting, but they're not coming to service on living stones, and they're not taking communion. Is what how are we supposed to understand a Christian Reformed minister doing this? Or shouldn't I be the guy that's, dragging people into
taking
the church,
every opportunity to make an altar call
and to give a clear presentation? Vendonk struggles with that more sometimes in his context than I do, because of the particularities of his church. And so no, I'm with you, maybe not in the same ways, but this bumping up into the holy or the sacred or the unnameable, and just not being able to know what to do with it, except somehow always having to try to figure out how to live with it.
That's why I started with the home is not tranquil.
No.
Home is not tranquil.
And it's going to be interesting to see where the talks go, because Vendonk is talking about these little shells on the Camino. When Vendonk thinks about home, or quest, especially, he thinks about the Camino.
Quest, yeah.
And when Vervaeke is thinking about prepping for this thing, he wants to study groups of people that don't have houses.
Right. Yeah.
And it's
that
like
book Homeless. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
it's going to be interesting. It's a little, and there's not too much of a hint from anybody actually as to what they're going to say.
No. And yet probably everything that everyone says, all of us will hear it and say, that's kind of what I expected them to say.
That's probably true. That's probably true.
Which to me makes, and this is, as I think, a lot of people ask, well, Vanderklee, what on earth are you doing? I mean, a lot of people want to know, what on earth am I doing? And a lot of me says, I'm not really quite sure either yet. And then some people say, that's bullshit. Okay. But for me, a conference like this, after the conference, there'll be videos for people to watch, and you'll get to see the talks. But I can go to YouTube and watch YouTubes of Woodstock or, other events that happen. But for me, I've been to a few of these things now, and the vitality of it is not necessarily on stage. And it's awfully hard to know, just like sort of the holy and the sacred, when it will sort of leap up and bite you.
I can read stories about recovery, but when my friend gives that testimony, it's an entirely different thing.
Yeah.
And so being there, that's spent a lot of, time gathered around this little campfire, and I'm happy to make it, incarnate.
Well, and I really appreciate you sort of, I mean, part of what so these conferences are different now too, partly because okay, so there's more Vanderklay out there than anybody wants to listen to. Pageau and Vervaeke are also easy to find on YouTube. Vendonk, he's in that estuary thing, whatever the heck's going on with him. But now there's also all these other. I mean, you can go and see the craziness of Grim Grizz and his savings throws. Chad the alcoholic.
I think of Grim Grizz and his rolling the dice is very much this moment of, you mentioned this before. It's like that moment where I'm deciding, what am I going to do with my brother, and it's wisdom and
So now not only do we have, let's say, people who are going to be on the stage, but the real fun of these conferences is meeting. And now that we've done this, a whole bunch of people are going to come up to you now and say, I watched your talk with Paul, and I heard about your brother and your friend with Jesus in the backyard, and they're going to tell you a story. And some of them are going to be, they're
going to try to show me the data about the book of Daniel, I'm sure.
Some, so that's going to come up. It's certainly going to come up, but it's in the, I guess part of why I keep doing what I'm doing is, again, not just the fact that sometimes I too live in a space that it can't contain all of me, so I need another place for more of me to go out to.
Definitely,
there's certainly that.
That's a good way of putting it.
But it's also that, doggone it, if the people aren't just so interesting. And not always in a pleasant way.
It's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
What have we done here?
Oh, well, we should entertain questions.
All right.
From the comment. Okay, you all in the comment stream, if you want to ask a question, just in all caps type question, and then we'll maybe we'll let some of you characters in. We need the hobo shanties campfire songs set so that we can sing along. And
I'm going to try to go to the campfire. I'm not going to camp, but I'm going to try to go over there. I hope. I don't know where it's going to be. I'll try.
I am too. I'll give you a ride. Vendonk said he's going to have a car for me to drive.
Yeah,
but
excellent.
just the fact that, I mean, it is the most insane thing that our campfire song leader is a Sikh who loves American folk music. So, I mean, to me, that's just the craziness of this whole thing.
It is.
Let's see. How did the author of Daniel know about the co-read? Okay, we're not going to get into Daniel talking.
Not do that,
just joking. All right, thanks. Okay, here's a question. What do we got here? Paul, can us lurkers expect from the different upcoming conferences? I've watched the channel for years, but not really involved in the Little Corner Internet Discord hierarchy. I don't know. What can... How to describe what to be expected? I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jim? I mean, you and I have both been to plenty of conferences in our lives.
Yeah, I expect people to get to know each other and be surprised by getting to know each other. That's been my experience in conferences where you go and you're like, I'm just going to sit over here and watch the lectures. But you'll meet people and you'll get to know them immediately. It happened when I was in Seattle. I met Benjamin Boyce actually at the conference and talked to him for a good long while. Yeah, it won't be hard to start making connections very quickly, I think. And I think that's what that you can expect that.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it's, this conference, it's going to be a little bigger than Thunder Bay. And these conferences are always, I mean, bigger is kind of nice if you want to fill out the budget and do some things. Smaller is nice if you want to sort of get a chance to talk to the people you've seen on YouTube. So I would say go to a conference like this trying to find a way to make new connections with other people who really enjoy what you enjoy.
Oh, so
seeing where that goes.
Gavin Palmer, the song would be By the Rivers of Babylon by Sublime. I'll let people chew on that one.
Oh, what did Gavin ask?
He asked, what song would I sing at the fire?
Oh, okay. Question: is this event to come a Jesus Revival tent meeting with Peter, Paul, and Mary?
Well, it would be nice if Mary were there, actually. Mary Cohen, I'm speaking of.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And
she
that's
was
fun.
important. She was I didn't meet her. Spent a couple of emails with her, but she was important to me.
Yeah. And again, she was, talk about someone who could be dogmatic.
Oh man. Yeah. But what a joy. What a solid woman.
Oh, so knowledgeable, wise, and that's
experienced, been through a lot.
Oh, and that's part of the funny thing. People, I think right now in our current cultural moment, people sort of have this allergy to dogmatism, and they don't realize that, and this is sort of, Buechner really integrates this into Beb as well. If you're allergic to dogmatism, you're really going to miss a lot of very worthwhile people in this world.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, Ethan. That's right, Ethan.
I've delivered a few babies in my day, but not recently. Ethan. Not recently.
So Ethan lives up in Reno, and he very much wants to come, but his wife is very pregnant.
Yeah.
So no, Ethan, you should stay home.
Congratulations.
There'll be other conferences.
Yep.
That's the question
song.
You answered. Okay.
Rivers of Babylon.
Rivers of Babylon. Okay. I have a brother like Dr. Jim's. How do you show love to someone like that while setting boundaries and defending them?
Yeah, it's hard. That's the whole point about it, is that it's hard. And, we've been through this with this last 5 years of whatever's been going on, kind of in the more kind of media / political sphere. And it's been difficult in my family. I'll tell you, it has.
Yeah.
But it's not, we haven't let it, break us. So I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah. What do you say, Paul?
I think loving people, some people are easy to love. Some people are hard to love. That's just the truth. And I think in some ways, one of the most important qualities to develop, if you want to love people, is durability. You just have to not, as best as you can, get triggered and to hang in there. And that's, I love the old version of, long suffering is the older Bibles talked about that. And to love someone well is to learn to be long suffering. So, okay. How does Peterson's idea that you cannot let a loved one drown you as well as relate to y'all's convo?
Yeah. What I'd say to this is, I'm talking about me here, my experience. I can see circumstances have, I know there are circumstances in which those choices are harder than they have been for me, I think. And so I don't know that I want to judge other people in their situations. And I don't know. You're the pastor, Paul. I can give that to you.
Well, on one hand, that's a very important thing. And so all of my children were lifeguards at one point or another, because that's kind of our way to getting them into the public pool. And it's one of the first things you teach is that don't let the person you're saving drown you. And as a pastor, that's an important thing that you learn. But these are in our movies too, there are also moments, and usually they only come once or or maybe twice in your life where you have to go in knowing full well that this person will drown you and you're going to die anyway. And so you say, okay, I'll do it. And in many ways, that's sort of at the heart of Christianity, is if, Jesus wasn't going to let himself be drowned by us, he never should have come. So that's, and in these conversations, I talk to some people who will say, you shouldn't talk to this person because you're platforming them. It's kind of like, I don't know. How much of a platform do I really have? And so I have to take my cues from Jesus, and people complain to Jesus about how he platformed people too. The whole story of Zacchaeus is fundamentally about platforming. So, no, we're all going to drown at some point. So every now and then, you say, all right, they might drown me, but I got to go in. And I don't think that's very non-Petersonian. All right. Let's see. We just have 5 more minutes. I'm going to drop the link in case someone wants to come, has something they need to say or do. Any good books or movies you've watched lately, Jim?
My family has done a kind of group thing on silence.
On the book or the movie?
Both.
Oh, really? I haven't watched the movie.
We committed to the book after my son and I already watched the movie, and we had it was very interesting because I find that to be difficult. I didn't even find initially I wasn't feeling like I would like it. In fact, in some senses, I didn't like it. But then the conversation really made it much more enriching, and my kids and we had a really very good conversation about it. So we're going to keep that going. And it was complex. We don't want to get into that right now, but
right.
It was good. It worked.
It's interesting. I remember the first conversation we had, you sort of talked about the fact, and this sort of touches on it too, that it seems like you've developed a culture in your family of in some ways doing in your family what we've sort of done in this little corner of the internet too.
Yeah, I think so. And it's more complicated than that, obviously, but my son has a sensibility like me, so he drives to kind of engage with more and more ideas, and he's always going off in different directions than I would anticipate. And he's more creative and artistic than I am. He's got a band. He does music. Everybody should listen to the band. It's called The Slow. He's got a song called Mexican Gandalf. I mean, come on, how can you go wrong with that? And another one called Eucharistia, and it's Christian themes in it. Anyway, plug for the band. It's called The Slow. You can find it on Spotify.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, all my kids are different. And
how many kids do you have?
3.
Okay.
2 girls and a boy. And my wife and I have been married since the mid 80s. And my family's still, I have 4 sibs, and they're all still around, as my parents are. So we're all getting together regularly. And my son just moved to Santa Fe. We were just down there. It was fantastic. So,
wow. Well, fun city, fun place to live. All right. Question. This is from Mark in Ireland. Did Dr. Jim get a chance to watch Tom Hanks' Western News of the World?
I have watched that. I can't remember. I'm not going to be able to sketch it out, but I did watch that. And now that was just recently. No, that's not what I was thinking. Haven't seen it yet. I've heard good things about it, however. Did you see it, Paul?
I have not seen it.
Yeah.
I have not seen it. So, all right. I think, Matt, we have not had much chaos introduced. That's absolutely okay. And maybe it's a good time to land the plane. So,
again, Paul, thanks as always. I really love to indulge my desire to just talk
a chaos monster has entered the pool.
Sam.
Hey,
all right, Sam.
Hey,
we've got
Sam,
would-be heretics, and a real one comes into the room.
Sam and I talked once before.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Long while ago. But.
Yeah. I was wondering, not to psychoanalyze Pageau too much, but I still think it's interesting that Pageau didn't either become Baptist on the other end of his spiritual journey, or French Catholic as a way of sort of returning back home. But this orthodoxy is sort of like finding a different home. And I wonder about that. Like I'm not saying no one can ever change denominations or change forms of Christianity, but it always
better not say that.
I better not say that, right? But it always establishes a weird precedent, and then how's that going to affect your children's interpretation of the precedent? If you so now in Pageau's family, right? Grandparents French Catholic, parents Baptist, or parents grandparents go from French Catholic to Baptist. Parents go from Baptist to Orthodox. It's a difficult thing to integrate into a family multi-generational identity when there's a conversion. So I was just wondering what you thought of that.
That's a good question. It's maybe a bit of a challenging question. I think
I don't know. We stay CRC. Well, at least up till me. We'll see what happens with my kids.
Well, what's your answer, Sam? It was the art, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean,
got him into
it is an arc, and I think it'll be interesting watching this new generation of Orthodox converts that we see so many examples of in our corner of the internet, how intergenerationally durable this will be, let alone how durable over 5 or 10 years in these individuals' lives will be. I'm hoping nothing but for the best, but I don't know. It seems like a way of avoiding rescuing your father from the belly of the whale sometimes, to find a different instead of defending and trying to fix your own tradition, you pick a different one. Defend Western civilization. Actually, I kind of like Eastern civilization. I'm just going to go over there. And I wonder what the long-term effects of that will be. And I'm struggling with similar issues myself. But
well, here's an interesting comment. The Orthodox denominations are very nationalistic. Are we going to have sort of an American nationalist orthodoxy?
Catholicism basically had to transition from being a bunch of ethnic enclaves into being a national version of American Catholicism. It took a while to do that, right? Like it used to be in like the 19th and early 20th centuries that you could tell which Catholic church you were supposed to go to because the saint would be a person from your country of origin. Yep. And if you were Irish, you would go to St. Patrick's and, et cetera. And that it took a while for that to desegregate. And it's like, it hasn't completely happened. There's some churches in Chicago that are still very, very Irish and some that are very, very Italian, et cetera. But we don't think of the Catholic Church anymore as being racially denominated. It's just the Catholic Church in America. And Orthodoxy seems to be doing that more slowly. And that's partially because they don't have a pope and their hierarchy is still very nationalized. But theoretically, the way that the Orthodox Church is operating in America isn't the way it should. There shouldn't be a church that is here in Chicago that's underneath the Greek patriarch. And then if I go over there, that church is underneath the Russian patriarch. They should all be underneath the Chicago patriarch or something like that, or at least the Chicago.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about, you could deconstruct Orthodoxy's history in the way, I mean, they have the history, I believe, of being very nationalistic, not just nationalistic, but married to the political structure of the origin country in a symbiote, in a connected way.
I think that's right. And you're exactly right, Sam. I mean, if they were to be consistent, we would have the Bishop of Chicago and the Bishop of Sacramento. And instead, they just act like Christian denominations in North America.
But of course, it's falling apart elsewhere as well, because if you look at what's going on in Ukraine, and the efforts to split, and I mean, they have their schism problems just like everybody else.
Yeah. Agreed.
Sam, it's good to see you. I still follow a lot of what you do. Your you're a really smart guy. I really respect your output. So you and
Well,
Hank
thanks.
it's worthy.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
you had to
appreciate that.
mention Hank.
And I had to mention Hank.
He
I got
will
a
watch
problem with your polar bear theory, but we could talk about that another time.
Yeah.
All right. Is it time to land the plane, gentlemen?
I'm ready.
All
Thanks
right.
again.
All right.
Really appreciate it, and see you in a week.
All right. Very good.
Don't have too much fun with that.